When Henry VIII came onto the throne in 1509, he was a sign of strength and power. He was a tall, handsome and athletic man who excelled in strength. However, as he approached his death in January 1547, he was a shadow of his former self, having a waist measurement of 52 inches and a chest of around 53 inches. Henry VIII's physical appearance declined heavily, and this is often linked to his short-temperedness with the fate of his wives. Today we look at England's most famous king, and in particular what happened when Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547. He left behind a kingdom in which was very different to when he came onto the throne, and England under Henry was certainly left a changed nation. Henry VIII made his mark on the country, and today he is remembered as England's most famous king. However, join us today as we look at the death of Henry VIII. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Henry VIII as a king is most remembered for his 6 wives. However, throughout his life, he did encounter and suffer from a number of serious and severe illnesses. At the age of 23, for example, he caught smallpox, a deadly disease, but he recovered, and 7 years later, aged 30, he caught malaria. Aged 33, he had a famous jousting accident which plagued him for a long time. Whilst jousting with the Duke of Suffolk, Henry was hit on the head above the right eye with a lance. Following this, he suffered from terrible migraines. Later, he also had another severe jousting accident at the age of 45, in which he fell from his horse and was squashed by the weight of his armour and the horse falling upon him. He was left unconscious for 2 hours. This is believed to have also what caused his mood swings, and one study even attributing his change in body and mental state to have been the result of this jousting accident, saying that he suffered a traumatic brain injury on the tilt yard. In his later years, Henry began to gain a huge amount of weight and began to severely overeat, becoming very obese, and he could have even had diabetes and high blood pressure. One of the main reasons the king's condition became worse was due to the fact he suffered from varicose ulcers, and his ulcers in his legs would cause him to give up sports and exercise, and towards the end of his life, he even had to be carried around in a chair due to the pain. As his lifestyle became worse, his health severely declined. Obesity hastened his death, and at the age of 55 he passed away on the 28th of January 1547 at the Palace of Whitehall. The day before his death, Henry saw his confessor and received Holy Communion. It was clear to anyone who attended on the king or visited him that death was imminent. However, the doctors did not have the courage to tell this to the king. This was treason, and predicting the king's death, no matter what, could result in you losing your head. This was left to Sir Anthony Denning, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, who bravely on the 27th of January told Henry that, in man's judgment, you are not like to live, and that he should remember his sins as every good Christian man should do. Henry responded with, "The mercy of Christ is able to pardon me of all my sins, yes, though they were greater than they be." Henry on his deathbed was realising that he committed a huge amount of sin throughout his life, for example not at least by ordering the executions which would make his reign famous. It's not exactly known how many people were executed by order of the king. However, some estimates even suggest that it could have been around 72,000 people killed at the behest of the notorious Henry VIII. The second half of Henry's reign is mostly categorised by the execution of wives, relatives, close friends and confidants and powerful nobles. He had even ordered the death around a week earlier of his last victim, Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. Because of this, Henry's last known words and orders were to summon Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to his side. Denny asked the king whether he wanted any learned man to speak with, and the king responded that he should get Cranmer to be by his side. He then went into a sleep, and after this he would consult with the Archbishop. Cranmer was sent for, but it took him hours to make his way to the palace on the frozen roads. Cranmer arrived after midnight on the 28th of January and made his way to the king's bedside. However, Henry was in his last few hours and was beyond talking, being barely conscious. His last moments have been described as, "At the end there was no master and servant, no prince and churchman, just a priest preparing a departing soul for eternity." Cranmer begged Henry to give a sign that he trusted Christ for salvation, and in response he felt a grip on his hand tighten slightly. It was an evangelical departure, no anointing, no reading of Latin prayers, just a simple acknowledgement of the all-sufficient atoning work of Christ. Shortly after, around 2 AM, King Henry VIII died. His exact cause of death remains uncertain, however it's believed to have been a pulmonary embolism or renal and liver failure. It's been recorded mostly though how Henry died from natural causes. For the next 2 days after Henry's death, his body remained resting in his chamber undisturbed, and his passing was kept a secret, even to the point where his meals were still being brought to his lodgings. On the morning of the 31st of January, the Lord Chancellor announced the King's death to Parliament in tears, declaring the King dead. On the same day, Henry's son Edward VI was proclaimed King and taken to the Tower of London to await his coronation. For a few days Henry's body was embalmed and encased in lead, surrounded by burning tapers, and it laid in state in the Presence Chamber at Whitehall before being moved to the chapel. Across the nation, bells would toll in the memory of their late king. On the 14th of February 1547, Henry VIII's body made its final journey from Whitehall to Windsor. The huge coffin was covered in blue velvet and cloth of gold, was laid down on a chariot drawn by black horses who drew it along the roads that had been prepared and widened for the procession. On top of the coffin was a wax effigy of the king, on its head a crown atop of a nightcap of black satin full of precious stones. The procession paused overnight at Sion Abbey, before the next day reaching Windsor. It took 16 strong yeomen of the guard to carry Henry's coffin into the church and lower it into the vault in the choir of St George's Chapel, with the king being laid to rest next to Jane Seymour, his queen, and mother of Edward VI. At the conclusion of the funeral ceremony, the chief officers of the household broke their white staves of office and threw them into the vault after the coffin, signifying the end of their roles as serving the master. Henry VIII had planned to have been buried in a huge Renaissance tomb that he had taken from Cardinal Wolsey after his sudden death in Leicester. However, the work was never completed. Henry's sarcophagus today does survive, however today it's at the base of Lord Nelson's tomb in his crypt at St Paul's Cathedral. He simply lies today under a simple 19th century black marble floor slab that reads, "In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII 1537 and King Henry VIII 1547. Interred in the same vault as the notorious king is also the final resting place of Charles I and also one of Queen Anne's children who died in infancy." To many, Henry VIII is England's most notorious monarch. However, he met his death in relative quiet, in the peace of the Archbishop of Canterbury and also members of his household. His quiet death, in which Thomas Cranmer spoke to him, doesn't echo the chaos in which he caused to so many throughout his life, be it through executions, political change or religious reform. He was a king whose life today captivates so many, and in his death he became almost a legendary figure, with the incredible and sometimes barbaric stories of his reign. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.